Welcome to the new Hegelian Philosophy channel and another episode of the Absent Connection newscast. Today we will ask a very simple but totally forbidden question. Is it even possible, mathematically, in accord with common sense, ecologically, in terms of energy costs, fossil fuels, etc., for the AI craze to turn a profit? Now, we cannot help but remember one of the warnings that John O'Michael Greer has put out over and over again, taken from The Limits to Growth, the prophetic study from decades ago. He warned that the limits to growth are almost always misunderstood because people think that the limits in question are technical. So if you could imagine a technically feasible solution to the problem, then that proves that the problem doesn't exist. He says it's almost always misunderstood that the limits to growth for a nation, a company, a civilization, the planet Earth, the entire human race on the planet Earth, the limits are not technical, they're economic. And he gives the analogy of a person with a terminal illness. It doesn't matter if there exists technically something that could cure it. If it's so expensive that you can't afford it, you're still going to die. Okay, and that's an imperfect analogy because you can imagine, oh, but what if somebody else has the money for it? Well, in the context that we're talking about now, there is no bigger entity that could cover it because the failure for this whole craze to be profitable is not only financial, in which case you could argue, well, the government could just print more money. And by the way, they've leaked that is the long-term plan. The CEO from one of these companies was recently asked, how exactly are you going to meet the $2 trillion per year threshold for revenue, which was estimated by Bain Capital will be necessary for all of this investment into AI data centers, etc., extremely expensive, and the energy costs, etc., to actually turn a profit. How are you going to make $2 trillion a year providing answers on ChatGPT, basically, when even if you were to charge people money for it, you would come nowhere close to $2 trillion. There's not a company in the world today that actually brings in, a single company, $2 trillion per year. That's an outrageous amount of money for a service which is, once again, at the moment, free. And the CEO basically let out the silent part out loud. He said, well, the government will have to be the insurer of last resort or something like that. You might have seen this interview, the clip from this interview recently, in which he was basically leaking that the $2 trillion revenue projection is not actually going to be met because it's mathematically impossible, but it doesn't matter. The government can bail us out as something too big to fail for. If this industry goes down, the U.S. economy goes down with it. At this point, the only thing that made GDP positive this year with the mass layoffs, with people cutting back on spending due to inflation, with people having their cars repossessed as a major warning sign that if they can't even make their car payment, then they're in dire financial stress because it was once said, you can live in your car, but you can't drive your apartment to work. So if they're repossessing your car, it means you've already stopped paying everything else. Student loan defaults have hit a new high of 15%. So the only thing that kept the economy growing nominally on paper this year was the AI craze. So he's basically saying we have the United States held hostage. If the AI bubble goes down, the U.S. economy goes down with it, because at this point there is nothing else, quote-unquote, growing. And he let out the silent part out loud by saying that at the end of the day, we're not going to make the $2 trillion, but it doesn't matter. The government can just print a $1 trillion large bailout, which we, the CEOs, will then pocket and move on, with our golden parachute to some other sort of scam on Wall Street. And he's just let out that. Now, once again, the idea that the limits to growth are economic, not technical, might be misunderstood there too. You might say, well, as this guy is thinking in accord with common sense, well, of course we can't actually make $2 trillion a year for a service that is largely free and not worth paying for, since about 20% of what the AI produces is hallucinations or nonsense, and we don't tell you when it's nonsense. So if you were gullible enough to actually try to hire this to do a person's job, you would spend as much time trying to find the nonsense in what it said as you spent before just having a human do the job. So we could see what sort of a scam this is, which people are starting to catch on to. As somebody who used to work in a factory, I know that an 80% success rate might sound intuitively like pretty good, but it's absolutely abysmal in the world of manufacturing. Your defect rate in a factory should be well under, 1%. Way less than 1% should be defective product. This is 20%. And by the way, extremely expensive to produce that much garbage. So the problem here is that he is assuming, of course, that at the end of the day, you're not going to have a bunch of people paying outrageous amounts of money to have 20% of the output be garbage. What's really going to happen is that when there starts to be a crisis here, they're going to ask the government for a trillion-dollar large bailout, which they will comply with, of course, by printing the money out of nowhere into existence and causing inflation for you. If you don't think they would do that, just look at the Biden years. The money supply increased 40%. In the single year of 2021, biggest single year increase money supply in history, which led some people to become a lot more wealthy. The wealthiest in America, their net worth grew $1.7 trillion during the Biden years because of the money he printed. But it will cause inflation for you. Okay, so you think $20 a meal at McDonald's is bad? Try $80 a meal. You think it's impossible? Let's see how much money they print to bail these guys out. But the problem is, once again, the limits to growth in question here are not financial, in which case you could always print more money. They're ecological. The limits we're really talking about have to do with fossil fuels and fresh water, because the only thing that keeps this scam going is an outrageous amount of both. In these huge AI data centers, there's so much electricity consumed by companies that claim to be environmentalists and concerned about sea change and G-warming and all of these other cliches. There's so much consumed that people who actually are unfortunate enough to live near these have found that their power bills have doubled in recent years. Residents of Columbus, Ohio, for example, are paying twice the amount for electricity because they're competing with these things that are sort of right, only about 80% of the time. It's also the water to keep it cool down, because the chips in question are actually more like graphics cards. NVIDIA used to be known for pretty much nothing except gaming. Now, there were a few guys I knew growing up who actually were serious enough about gaming that they would spend hundreds of dollars on a new graphics card. Well, that was from this company. But that was not for AI purposes. It was just to have better graphics while they were playing Assassin's Creed or some other game on their computer. So they're using graphics cards for a purpose they were not designed for, with so much energy that they would actually melt if they were not being cooled down by enormous amounts of water, in which case, well, now you have to start competing with the machines for water. You want to have a shower once a week? Well, okay, that's a path you may want to go down, but you can see the limits here are not a matter as simple as just having the government print more money and then hand it to the CEOs so they can flee on their golden parachutes to another scam on Wall Street, which is what their plan is. No, the limits in question are much more non-negotiable than that, and the government can't do anything about them. It can print more money. Can it print more water? Can it print more fossil fuels at a time where they're already far beyond the peak? Those are the limits, which of course we're not allowed to talk about, because even if you do bring up the forbidden number, can you make $2 trillion a year charging people to use ChatGPT, which is at best a way to find stuff people already said on Reddit if you ask a question, and then to condense it down to a shorter form, use a thesaurus to change some of the words, and then use some sort of a fancy grammatical changer to, for example, turn a complete sentence into a prepositional phrase or, an adjectival modifier, and make it seem for people who didn't read the original that this was a totally new thought, which the AI thought up itself. In reality, it's just taking stuff already said by people who may themselves be wrong, by the way. It is possible for somebody on Reddit to not know what they're talking about. And they're basically just plagiarizing this at high speed. That's what Jim Rickards called AI. It's a high-speed plagiarizer. Maybe useful in some contexts, like if you don't want to do your homework because you'd rather spend 7 nights per week on college campus getting drunk instead of just 2 nights per week during the weekend. Useful maybe for that, but definitely not actually capable of the kind of original thinking which they are attributing to it. But even beyond that debate, the question of whether the limits to growth as economic rather than technical, as having to do with resources rather than money, the debate whether that will expose all this to be a scam, something we're really not allowed to discuss, but we have to.